Thank you, Cameron. All right, so I'm tasked with the topic of pluralism today. So today we'll explore this concept in the world, in the neighborhood, and in the self. Within communities and within themselves, people are multifaceted. To be multifaceted is to be plural. So that's being many things. In the global community, in a neighborhood or a congregation, and in an individual, there are interconnected systems which contain multiple ways of thinking, acting, and being. So to a pluralist, in a context of self and another, love is the tool we need to meet this multifacetedness that feels like an other, without othering. And by othering, we mean excluding or jeering or thinking they can't dance. So let's consider how loving thoughts and actions lead to kind curiosity and compassionate coexistence. So in the story for all ages, Giraffes Can't Dance, the jungle animals had diversity. Consider the different animals dancing different dances. Warthogs waltzing and lions tangoing, but they also acted with judgment and exclusion. Gerald's other way of being the only giraffe, his clumsiness, his shyness, were met with sneers and jeers from the other animals. But when Gerald experienced a welcome from the cricket and his own connection to the moon, he learned to listen to and move to music that he loved. He was an animal who could dance as much as any other animal, but perhaps not a cha-cha or a Scottish reel. Gerald seemed more like a freestyle contemporary dancer. But now in the real world, humanity is also quite diverse, and the stakes of being in conflict are much higher than animals in a story at a dance. So the tool for pluralism in the world, I think, is universalism. By universalism, I mean viewing every culture and each person with acceptance of shared worthiness of full humanity. Not every idea that comes from every person or every culture is good, but within every person is a capacity for good. And I want to ask the question how I can meet that capacity for good in the most loving way. That means I will be aware of potential harm, but I will not be stopped and stunned by my fear. I will set boundaries. I will act wisely, but also kindly. I know that it is outside my scope, and probably even the scope of the many of us in this congregation here and online, to solve global problems, global fighting and wars. But we can still call out the hatred that we see and the violence in language that we see. Call out Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. We can participate in sending aid, perhaps to hospitals, and we can check on colleagues and friends whose families are directly impacted to create a safe space to listen to their feelings. My invitation for all of us to ask, what is the loving thing that we can do? What are the things that uphold our universalism, our belief in humanity's inherent worth and dignity? Friday was International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia, which occurs on May 17th because it is the anniversary of homosexuality being declassified as a mental disorder. So one of the goals of that day is to bring awareness of the violence that lesbian, gay, bi, and trans people face. So I think it's okay to meet that kind of hatred with a no and side against it. The no doesn't mean less love for a person's humanity or for your own. I'm going to maintain my personal boundaries, and I'm going to think that it's a bad idea to vote for policies that cause harm. And at the same time, I want to keep adding more love into the community. First, for the marginalized community, engaging in ways to create spaces that are affirming and inclusive. Also, I accept that other people have opposite gender marriages. I have a same gender-loving marriage. And I accept that people feel comfortable with or identify with the gender they were assigned at birth. Though we are different from each other, our experience and expression, we have the human right to live our own truth creatively. I don't know why that word tripped me up. And to be at peace with one another. Another way to think about the multifacetedness of humanity, including the capacity for good and harm, is through the theory of internal family systems. So internal family systems was proposed by Dick Schwartz when he was working with bulimic patients. And he found them saying, part of me says, you're too fat and you need to binge. But another part says, I feel so empty inside and I need to eat. And by doing this, he realized that people have multiple parts within that act in different ways. And so his theory is that every person at the core is a self that's innately good, but there's also protective parts and more vulnerable parts. And those vulnerable parts can become exiled because of adversity, shame, hurt, abuse, and trauma. Now, we're talking globally right now. So imagine individuals who've experienced so much, who have a core self that's good and worthy and inherent humanity, but when they're interacting with each other, everyone becomes so protective and fearful. And so the abuse and the shame, and it just multiplies, so it's a completely complex system. But the core of the protective parts are also good, but they can take extreme roles and cause harm. So the idea of internal family systems is to find the core self, which is immutable in its goodness, and manifest the C qualities: curiosity, compassion, courage, clarity, connectedness, creativity, calm, and confidence. As much as I've studied those, I still have to write them down and read them out because they're hard to remember, all 8 C's. But the C qualities that I would emphasize in global pluralism are courage, clarity, and connectedness. But you might be drawn to other qualities. I think the courage to speak out when people are being hurt and when there's violence happening, but I do that in love. The clarity to think about the different angles of a situation and see many perspectives. And that connectedness to know that the well-being of another person is related to my own well-being. But let's move inward a little bit to pluralism in the quote-unquote neighborhood. Now, my idea of a neighbor is influenced by Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan, because I heard that story from lots of youth pastors during my time in Christian churches as a teen. Let me take a sip of water. I remember the stories, and they would sometimes act it out, and so they call kids up, and someone would be the man who was attacked by the robbers, and someone would be the priest. And there was one time we actually got the choir robes and dressed up, and so it's like vividly impressed onto my mind. And the youth pastors, they would extrapolate meaning, what was going on through the mind of the priest and the Levites, a religious leader, and explain that passing on the other side might be appropriate for them to do, that they weren't doing that out of despising the man in the ditch, but just upholding their own holiness and their codes. So there was ways that we were being compassionate even for the people who did the thing that wasn't neighborly in the story. But the man who did the neighborly thing, the Good Samaritan, helped the traveler who was found on the road. And because it's a good story, I think I'm just going to read it from Luke 25 through 37 so we can get to know it or remember it. So it goes, on one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law, he replied. How do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. You have answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this and you will live. But the man who was asking the question wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? And Jesus starts telling a story. So in reply, Jesus said, I think Jesus was a little bit like our youth pastor who would act things out a little bit. So Jesus in reply, a man was going down to Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by the other side. So too a Levite, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he passed by the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, the denarii pieces of money. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expenses you may have. Then Jesus goes, which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The experts in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. So we can complicate this story a little bit and talk more about the conflict and the beliefs about Samaritans in the Jewish community at the time, about how they sometimes were thought of as lesser than, and there was some prejudice, and it was not expected that the Samaritan would be the hero in the story. But we don't have a lot of time. But I think from reading the story itself, we see that the one who had mercy was the neighbor. And in our communities, which are so complicated with many different ideas and potential for harm toward one another, with people who have well-placed piety and holiness that is appropriate, some of us need to go down in the ditch and take pity, not say like, oh, I wonder why nobody else did this work, but be with the person who's hurting. So the way I want to show my love to another person I meet is with generosity, to put aside my piety or fear and be compassionate. My idea of neighbor is also influenced by Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood I watched growing up. Fred Rogers explored kindness, imagination, and feelings. When there were laws forbidding interracial swimming pools, Mr. Rogers invited a black actor on the show to join him in a foot soak. Mr. Rogers used characters and stories to teach ideas. Was it King Friday? He was always just upset about something. So he taught kids and grown-ups to think about what we can do with our mad feelings. And not that the anger is wrong or bad, but that it happens, and that we cannot be harmful when we feel angry about things. I also think about pluralism in a neighborhood through working in a community hospital. The hospital I currently work at is called Good Samaritan. Funnily enough, I always have that story in my mind. And their goal to be a beacon of healing in a neighborhood. The area has a geographic connection, practically and concretely, imminently interconnected. The differences, plurality of ways of being and thinking, do not negate a shared experience. Same with the church and congregation is also a community, like a virtual neighborhood by the decision to be on a shared journey. So my C qualities for pluralism in the neighborhood would be curiosity, compassion, and creativity. Curiosity to think, like the Good Samaritan did, I wonder what happened to the man in the ditch. I wonder if he's been attacked and how I can help. Then I do something to show compassion, to create a solution. How can I be creative? And then for Mr. Rogers, how can I be creative enough to express my anger without causing more pain or hurt? And then what stories from both Fred Rogers and Jesus, what stories can I tell to act out or to create lessons in my community? I like that Gerald giraffe story, for one. In the world, the neighborhood and the person, when met with something other than what feels familiar or comfortable, something that's a new idea or a new expression, the protector parts might send those danger signals. But there is an innately curious core self that can come forward instead, not to completely ignore the wisdom of the protective parts, but to take the lead on accepting the humanity of another person or another part of ourselves. The plurality within our own person can be difficult to accept. We've built tools since we were little, giving roles to protector parts to take care of the vulnerable bits. These parts are afraid that bad things will happen if they don't stay in those roles. And we might have parts that are incongruent with one another. So I have a part that feels like I need to go shopping when I have a new event because I am afraid of looking frumpy. And I have this vivid memory of my mother's judgment about how I present myself and how I might represent the family. Don't look fat. Don't look poor. Then there's also a part of me that wants to rebel against my feelings of shame and my mother's voice. To say, I'll wear a damn sack if it feels comfortable. And then there's a part that hates my shopping part because it's angry about consumerism. And what do I do with the internal plurality? I want to let the core self take the lead with curiosity so that I know all of those stories that are going on inside of me and all the differences and the plurality that's there. Compassion for how they got there and the stories that they tell. Courage to take a chance. Maybe I go to Goodwill and I do get a new outfit every once in a while, but that appeases my anti-consumerism mindset too. And clarity, connectedness, creativity, calm, and confidence. So in the centering time, we'll spend some more time with our internal curiosity to get to know our parts and just accept that plurality within. But that's all for now.